You're listening to the Philosopher's Note on Learned Optimism. More wisdom in less time.
This is Brian welcoming you to the Philosopher's Notes on Learned Optimism. How to Change Your Mind and Your Life by Martin Seligman. We'll start with a quote from Martin Seligman. He says, "Habits of thinking need not be forever. One of the most significant findings in psychology in the last 20 years is that individuals can choose the way they think." So you're saying to yourself, I can learn optimism? Yep. According to psychologist Dr. Martin Seligman, you sure can. And if you believe the research, you definitely should. We all know that optimists see the glass as half full, while pessimists see it as half empty. But that doesn't come close to doing justice to the importance of optimism and how it affects our lives. Martin Seligman, past president of the APA, the American Psychological Association, the visionary behind the positive psychology movement, and one of the leading psychologists in the world, has spent the last 3.5 decades researching the influence of optimism on our lives. Much of his work is presented in his book, Learned Optimism: How to Change Your Mind and Your Life. In this note, we'll take a quick look at the underlying theories of optimism, talk about some cool applications, such as optimistic professionals sell more and optimistic sports teams win more, and we'll talk about how you can improve your optimism. I hope you enjoy. We'll start with the first big idea, cognitive therapy versus behaviorism. Let's start with a quick history lesson in psychology. It wasn't too long ago that the field of psychology was dominated by B.F. Skinner and his lineage that believed everything was a result of how we were conditioned. In fact, when Seligman and his colleagues first presented the idea around 1965 that we could learn new cognitive strategies that would result in different behaviors, the old-school behaviorists thought that was blasphemy. Now, of course, we know that cognitive therapy does work, and the explanatory style lessons we'll explore in this note form a critical part of this work. First, let's look at the next big idea, optimism versus positive thinking. Quote, "Learned optimism is not a rediscovery of the power of positive thinking. Changing the destructive things you say to yourself when you experience the setbacks that life deals all of us is the central skill of optimism. From a scientific perspective, optimism does not equal positive thinking. As Seligman says, quote, pessimists can in fact learn to be optimists, and not through the mindless devices like whistling a happy tune of mouthing platitudes." And he says, every day in every way I'm getting better and better. Not by that, but by learning a new set of cognitive skills, end quote. It's all about the way you interpret something that happens to you. How you think about a positive or negative event determines quite a bit. We're going to go into more detail about optimism, what it is, how it's been proven to be a good thing, and how you can increase your level of optimism. We'll start with a quick look at learned helplessness, and then look at the mechanics of optimism itself. Learned helplessness. Quote, learned helplessness is the giving up reaction, the quitting response that follows from the belief that whatever you do doesn't matter. Explanatory style is the manner in which you habitually explain to yourself why events happen. It is the great modulator of learned helplessness. An optimistic explanatory style stops helplessness, whereas a pessimistic explanatory style spreads helplessness. End quote. Learned helplessness. I first learned about this as an undergraduate psychology student at UCLA. The theory was developed by Seligman and his colleagues in their work with dogs. Now, as a quick note, as an animal lover, I appreciated Seligman's comments on his book about the ethics of his use of animals in his experiments and his commitment to their well-being in the context of striving to learn lessons he could then apply to humans. Part of a whole longer discussion, though. So, for this study, imagine 2 dogs. The first dog is slightly shocked, but has a lever he can push that will stop the shocks. He quickly learns to stop the shocks. He's in good psychological shape, you could say. A second dog does not have a lever. He can't stop the shocks. Rather, the shocks stop whenever the first dog hits his lever. So, in effect, the shocks are random. Our second dog learns that he is helpless in the face of these shocks. Here's what's fascinating. The dogs are then moved to a new area. and taught a new way to avoid the shocks. So now they can both avoid the shocks equally at will. Remarkably, although the first dog avoids the shocks easily, the second dog curls up in the corner and whimpers as the shock, which he could have avoided, is administered. So, how does this apply to humans? In short, we learn helplessness when we believe that nothing we do will change our circumstances, and then effectively give up. This learned helplessness is one of the strongest correlates of depression. The solution? We need to change our explanatory styles, which is the next big idea, explanatory styles. We are constantly talking to ourselves, if you haven't noticed. Let's call that our internal dialogue. Now imagine something bad happens, whether it's losing your job or getting in an argument with a friend or spouse. How do you tend to respond? What's your internal dialogue? Some people, the ones who tend to give up easily, habitually say things like, "It's my fault, it's going to last forever, and it's going to undermine everything I do." Others, who are less likely to give in to the tough times, say, "The outcome was out of my control. It's only temporary, and it's only specific to this part of my life." The bottom line is that we're always interpreting different events, both positive and negative, and Seligman calls the way we interpret these events our explanatory style. He has identified three primary elements of our explanatory style: permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. He calls these the 3 Ps, which leads us to our next big idea. The 3 Ps. Quote, "There are 3 crucial dimensions to your explanatory style: permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization." End quote. First, the permanence. The question here is it likely to continue? Is it permanent or temporary? The permanence is pretty straightforward. Something happens. Do you explain the results as permanent and likely to recur, or do you think it was temporary, just a fluke? If it's a bad thing, the optimist tends to think it's a fluke. If it's a good thing, they tend to think it's permanent. The opposite holds true for the pessimist. Good things are the flukes, and bad things are more likely to recur. Then we move on to the second P, pervasiveness. Is it reflective of your whole life? Is it universal, or is it specific? The pervasiveness looks at whether we believe an event is specific or universal. So, do we think the results of this one event apply to everything in our lives, or just that episode? With a good event, the optimist is more likely to extend it to her whole life. With a bad event, she will tend to isolate the incident as specific to that situation. The opposite holds true for the pessimist. If something good happens, they think it was a fluke. If something bad happens, they think it is representative of their whole life. Make sense? All right, and the third P, personalization. Internal or external. The personalization looks at whether we believe that we are responsible for the event, or if something outside of our control is responsible. The fancy psychological term for it is locus of control, whether you believe the control was internal or external. So let's say something good happens. An optimist pats himself on the back, internal locus of control, saying he did a good job. Same thing happens to a pessimist. He is more likely to attribute the success to luck, other people's hard work, or something else outside of his control. That'd be an external locus of control. Dope. Something bad happens. The optimist looks to things outside of himself, external, to explain the event, from bad luck to just having an off day. The pessimist, although they didn't take responsibility for the good event, they're eager to take responsibility for the bad event. They bring it internal. So, interesting stuff on those 3 Ps. And on a related note, think about realism. This is how Seligman addresses the fact that optimism is not always a good thing. In fact, many situations call for a strong level of pessimism and realism. For example, imagine a pilot experiencing trouble with his aircraft. This situation demands brutal realism. The same holds true for a business experiencing troubles. Although you want your leader to have hope and optimism for a bright future, you also need a healthy dose of realism to ensure success. All right, now that we've gotten a theoretical background, let's look at some cool studies. Seligman provides a range of interesting studies that support his theories. Let's check out a few here. The first one is Metlife. You might ask a very reasonable question: what does Metlife have to do with optimism? Well, actually, quite a bit. Metlife was one of the first organizations to work with Seligman to apply his theories to the working world, and the company did so with great success. Metlife, and all insurance companies, and many businesses for that matter, pay a lot of money to screen their candidates. Seligman believes that optimism is an important variable to look out for, and that this characteristic ties directly to the bottom line. We'll begin with traditional hiring wisdom, which says, quote, "There are two ingredients of success. The first is ability or aptitude, and IQ tests and SAT are supposed to measure it. The second is desire or motivation. No matter how much aptitude you have, says traditional wisdom, if you lack desire, you will fail. Enough desire can make up for meager talent." And Seligman continues, quote, "I believe that traditional wisdom is incomplete. A composer can have all the talent of Mozart and a passionate desire to succeed, but if he believes he cannot compose music, he will come to nothing. He will not try hard enough. He will give up too soon when the elusive right melody takes too long to materialize. Success requires persistence, the ability to not give up in the face of failure. I believe that optimistic explanatory style is the key to persistence." And finally, he says, the explanatory style theory of success says that in order to choose people for success in a challenging job, you need to select for three characteristics: 1, aptitude; 2, motivation; and 3, optimism. So Seligman took this theory to Metlife and tested it out. What did he find? In short, he found that insurance agents who scored in the less optimistic half of his test were twice as likely to quit as agents who scored in the more optimistic half. Further, the agents from the top quarter sold 50% more than the agents from the bottom quarter. So a little tip is, when you're hiring new employees, you're obviously going to make decisions based on the candidate's aptitude and motivation. But Metlife's results suggest you may want to consider your next candidate's optimism as well. All right, speaking of optimistic individuals, the next big idea focuses on Matt Biondi. You may remember Matt Biondi. He was the greatest swimmer of his era and one of the most victorious Olympians of all time. He also happened to be a subject in one of Seligman's research studies, an incredibly optimistic subject, in fact. And during the 1998 Seoul Olympics, Biondi was expected to bring home gold in all 7 of his events. His first 2 events were a disappointment. He received bronze and silver. And Seligman tells a story in the book about how he was watching the events at home, listening to the announcers ponder whether Biondi would rebound well following his 2 disappointments. Seligman says, quote, "I sat in my living room confident he would." Why? Quote, "Because his explanatory style was highly optimistic, and he had shown us that he got faster, not slower, after defeat." End quote. So how'd he do? In the last 5 events in Seoul, Biondi won 5 gold medals. So Seligman offers a coaching tip. He says, quote, "Optimism tells you who to select and recruit. If 2 prospects are close in raw talent, recruit the optimist. He'll do better in the long run." End quote. All right, let's stay in the sports genre and look at another interesting study Seligman did with the NBA. So he took his theories to the sports arena and found some interesting results. His question was, could a sports team be optimistic or pessimistic? And how would this affect its performance? His study, he focused on the Atlantic Division of the NBA. Holding other variables constant, his research team scientifically analyzed quotes from players and coaches to measure their level of optimism or pessimism following either a win or a loss. His findings: teams, and not just individuals, have a meaningful and measurable explanatory style. Following a loss, an optimistic team was much more likely to beat the spread. In his study, the Celtics were the quintessential optimists, always explaining away a bad loss as temporary, specific, and not their fault. They were an uncanny comeback team. Language they used included, "They were making good, quick cuts to the basket," and "That's the best I've ever seen a team run." The Nets, on the other hand, were mentally shipwrecked. They explained losses as permanent, pervasive, and their own fault. Things like we botched up things ourselves and blew all our opportunities. And this is one of the physically weakest teams I've ever coached. So the tip is don't bet against an optimistic team that just lost. All right, the next big idea, why you want to be optimistic. Seligman says, life inflicts the same setbacks and tragedies on the optimist as on the pessimist, but the optimist weathers them better. So, why should we care about optimism? Well, we've seen how it affects performance professionally and personally, and as Seligman points out, research has revealed that optimism plays a significant role on our overall health, from different rates of cancer to overall immune functioning. Plus, if you ever plan to run for president, you should know that Americans like optimists. In sum, it makes sense to be an optimist. All right, we're getting close. Becoming more optimistic. Seligman says, quote, unlike dieting, learned optimism is easy to maintain once you start. Once you get into the habit of disputing negative beliefs, your daily life will run much better, and you will feel much happier. Okay, so now you can see the significance of adopting a more optimistic personality, I hope. And you've learned the importance of paying attention to how you're responding to negative events. As we've discussed, we're constantly talking to ourselves. So the next time you find yourself anxious or worried, pause for a moment and pay attention to what you're saying to yourself. We tend to have automatic responses to different situations. We need to develop awareness of those automatic responses and then develop new, more effective ways to interpret life's events. The bottom line is pretty straightforward. Start paying attention to your internal dialogue. Notice the patterns and try to optimize your 3 Ps. Create new habits. Get momentum. The results will be exciting. And finally, commit to something bigger than yourself. I quote Seligman, he says, the life committed to nothing larger than itself is a meager life indeed. Human beings require a context of meaning and of hope, end quote. In his concluding chapter, Seligman states that the epidemic of individualism in our culture today is a strong contributor to our depression. He talks about a study in which researchers were unable to find a case of depression in the Stone Age Kaluli tribesmen of New Guinea. The suggested explanation? The connection among the members of tribe were so close that helplessness did not escalate to hopelessness. Hence, no depression. How about you? Are you committed to something bigger than yourself? How can you deepen your connection to your world today? All right, that wraps up this note on learned optimism. Let's take a quick look at Martin Seligman, the author of this great book, and then some other notes I think you'll enjoy, and the quotes from the PDF's sidebar. Martin E.P. Seligman is an American psychologist and writer. He is well known for his work on the idea of learned helplessness, and more recently, for his contributions to leadership in the field of psychology. He is the Robert A. Fox Leadership Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, Department of Psychology. He has served as president of the American Psychological Association and is a best-selling author, writing about positive psychology topics such as the optimistic child, learned optimism, what you can change and what you can't. That's adapted from Wikipedia. And you can learn more about all things authentic happiness, and I highly recommend you do, at AuthenticHappiness.com. Go to Martin Seligman's Research Alliance website, where you can get more info on the scientific research currently conducted in positive psychology at positivepsychology.org. And also, make sure you go to AuthenticHappiness.com. You can take a learned optimism test there that I highly recommend. And I have no doubt that if you enjoyed this subject, you'll love the notes on authentic happiness. I also think you'll like the notes on man's search for meaning, feel the fear and do it anyway, get out of your own way, overachievement, and the gifted adult. All right, so now a few quotes from the sidebar. We start with an E.E. Cummings poem. He says, yes is a world, and in this world of yes, live skillfully curled all worlds. Martin Seligman says, people who make permanent and universal explanations for their troubles tend to collapse under pressure, both for a long time and across situations. He also says, on a mechanical level, Cognitive therapy works because it changes explanatory style from pessimistic to optimistic, and the change is permanent. It gives you a set of cognitive skills for talking to yourself when you fail. And finally, Martin Seligman says, practice disputing your automatic interpretations all the time from now on. That's a great quote to end this learned optimism note on. Practice disputing your automatic interpretations all the time from now on. Master your explanatory styles. You will have learned optimism, and that's one of the best things you can do to sustain happiness throughout your life. So have a great day, and here's to learning optimism.
We hope you enjoyed this Philosopher's Note. Please go to www.philosophersnotes.com to download more.